have a cup of coffee. We'll be learning together for about an hour. Just wait just a moment because it's just now 10:30 and that's when we were scheduled to begin. I want to make sure that everyone who's able to join us can join us. In the meantime, if you can go to the chat feature at the bottom of of the um, the bottom of the page, tell me who you are and where you live, where you're from, where do you live, and I can see who you all are. I'm Ed Feinstein. I live in Encino, California, which is God's country, and I'm usually asleep for an hour by now. So, hi Noah, how are you doing? Noah Pollock. Miriam from San Francisco, welcome. Marion from LA. Thank you all. This is lovely. Congratulations. David Spiegel. Jeff, good to see you. Sharon, welcome. Lois, hi. Gail, hi. And Yona, my son. So, Allie, how you doing? I hope you're well. Carol and Norman, Murray, John Braun, my dear friend. Temple of Judea, welcome. Well, thank you all very, very much. It's 10:30, so we're ready to begin. It's a privilege to have all of you here. I want to wish you a very happy and oh, good, and Mark's here, good. A very happy and sweet Hag Sameach. I hope that you had blintzes tonight celebrating the giving of Torah. I don't have to tell you that this is the most unique Shavuos we've ever had. It's a Shavuos when we should have all been in shul, we should have been in people's living rooms, we should be learning, and instead we're staring into these screens. But the remarkable thing, I don't know if you've enjoyed this tonight, but I certainly did. We took a tour of the whole world this evening. We listened to rabbis and teachers in Israel, rabbis and teachers in New York and Chicago, rabbis and teachers from Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and rabbis and teachers from LA and San Francisco and Vancouver. It's been a real joy, and I hope that you had a chance to. Enjoy all of that. I think it's a gift to us all. I'm going to take just one moment and make a correction. I'll be right back. I have to make that's better. And I'll just make sure that the sound is on. Okay, if anybody has issues with the sound, just let me know. And I will. I'm a rabbi. I can talk loud. Okay, good. All right. This evening, it's my intention to present to you my favorite philosopher, the philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel is quoted very, very frequently. You'll hear rabbis and teachers frequently invoking his name and sharing his wisdom. And so people quote him, but not as many people read him as ought to be reading him. And I think it's a great joy to read Heschel. It's just very difficult. So tonight, what I'd like to do is to give you a fundamental introduction to how to read Heschel. And if you enjoy this talk tonight, then you'll do me a great compliment by picking up one of his books, particularly God in Search of Man, and beginning to make your way through it. I think you'll find this a life-transforming experience. Abraham Joshua Heschel, I never met him in person. I met him the first time through his books when I was 17 years old. I was a freshman in college in Northern California, got a call from my mother every Friday afternoon. She would call, and it was just before Thanksgiving. And she told me that the rabbi of the synagogue where I grew up wanted to set up a college reunion Shabbos. And he'd asked me if I would lead the services. He asked my mother to tell me. And, you know, I had long hair. I have long hair now. I had long hair and crazy ideas. And I'd rebelled, you know, just sufficiently enough from my home shul that I said to my mom, tell the rabbi that I dearly appreciate his kindness, but not this year. I've had enough with the synagogue. I need a different kind of Jewish experience. I felt that the synagogue was so irrelevant to the life I was living. Well, my mom reported this to the rabbi, and then the next week I get a call from mom, and she says, the rabbi would like to see you when you come home. And he loved me, and I loved him, and he was very gentle and kind. And I went over to his home and sat in his study, and he said, what's the problem? And I said, I got to tell you, the world is a very difficult place. There's a war going on. There's tremendous tension between generations. There's a tremendous sense of reevaluating the values by which we live. And I just don't feel like the synagogue speaks to that anymore. So he said to me, do me a favor, turn around, go to the bookshelf, count 3 shelves down. There's an orange book right at the end. Take out that book. And I took out the book, and he said, okay, open to the very first page and read aloud. Let me see if I can get this up for you. So this is what I read. Good. I hope that you can all see that. This is what I read to my rabbi. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. I said, hey, he's been to our shul. That's us. Irrelevant, dull, insipid, and oppressive. When faith is replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. He said to me, I want you to take this book and read it. I said, who is this? He said, this is Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel was a unique religious character, a unique Jewish philosopher with a unique perspective on the dilemmas of contemporary Judaism. A quick biography. Abraham Joshua Heschel was born in 1907 to a Hasidic family in Warsaw. Not just a Hasidic family, Hasidic royalty. 7 generations on his father's side, descendant from the Baal Shem Tov, 6 generations on his mother's side from the Maggid of Mezerich. He was already seen as a young child to be the next great Hasidic master, the great Hasidic master who would save European Hasidism. And he was an Ilui, he was a genius. If you remember the story of The Chosen, he was like Donnie Saunders. He was learning Talmud at a remarkable clip and absorbing religious literature. But when he was a boy, his father died. And his mother took over his education together with her brother, who was the Novominsker Rebbe. And they began to see that Abraham Heschel had a sensibility that was too big to be contained by the Hasidic world. He was sneaking out of the yeshiva at night to go down to the end of the block and to read poetry in the coffee houses, the Yiddish coffee houses in secular Warsaw. And if you want to hear some of his poetry, I gave it to you. By the way, this worksheet is available to you on the Valley Beth Shalom website, and I will put it in the chat in case anyone would like to look it up. His poetry is quite beautiful. It's a poetry that bespeaks a deep sense of religiosity, a deep sense of God's presence in the life, in the world that he lives in. Beautiful, beautiful Yiddish poetry. His mother and his uncle understood that he was too big, that his mind was growing too quickly to be contained in the world of the Hasidic shtibel. And so they made a remarkable decision. They decided to send him out of the community, out into the world. They sent him to Vilna, to a secular Jewish high school, where we have pictures of him. He shaved off his payas, he's wearing a cap, and he began to learn European culture, languages, literature, music, philosophy, art, and began to understand the world of the humanities, the world of human exploration. And when he graduated at the age of 19, instead of returning back to the shtibel to become the Rebbe, he went to Berlin, which at that time was the center of European culture and intellectual life. And he began to study at the University of Berlin. Now, the University of Berlin was a magnet for young men just like him, who had escaped from the narrow ghetto of Jewish learning and were seeking the humanities to seek to know all that human beings know. There is a story, and I can't verify it, but it's a damn good story, that in the same apartment building, living in the same neighborhood in Berlin, and studying in the same university was Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great heir to the Hasidic tradition, Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, who was the great heir to the Lithuanian Talmud tradition, who would go on to be the head rabbi at Yeshiva University, and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who would go on to be the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, all living in the same apartment. Now that must have been a great Shabbos afternoon. He studies Semitics, he studies philosophy, he teaches Talmud actually in the Reform Rabbinical School, and he finally finishes his PhD. He has to write and publish the PhD, and he writes about the biblical prophets. More about that in a few minutes. In order to get a doctorate in a German university, you had to get your PhD published. And in the 30s in Berlin, no Jew could publish anything. So he went back to Poland because he was a Polish citizen. And the Polish Academy of Science publishes his doctorate, and he receives his PhD. He goes back to Poland to get that document published and also to see his family. It's 6 weeks before the beginning of the Second World War. He can see what's coming. He's heard the rantings of Hitler in Berlin. He's seen the raging anti-Semitism, and he begs his family to leave with him. They have an uncle. His mother has a brother who lives in London, and they have visas and they can leave, but they won't leave. The brother can't leave. The uncle can't leave because he's the Rebbe of the community. The community is stuck there. His mother won't leave because her brother is there. And his sisters won't leave because they want to be with their mother. Heschel bids farewell to his family and goes to be with his uncle in London. And he never saw his family again. They were all killed in Auschwitz by the Nazis. He spent 6 months in London and then comes to America at the invitation of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, as an instructor in Bible. He lives a strange life. He doesn't speak English yet. He keeps kosher in a seminary that doesn't have a kosher kitchen. He's Shomer Shabbos in a place that questions his religious observance. But he begins to gather around him a circle of students who become his acolytes, including, for example, Sam Dresner, wonderful rabbi from Chicago. Finally, after 5 years, he's invited to New York City to become a faculty member at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And here he thought he would find a home. And the seminary did give him a place and did give him access to students. But the seminary was never really a spiritual home. For one thing, they denied that he was a philosopher. He was a professor of ethics and mysticism. And mysticism, in the eyes of the seminary philosophers, the seminary faculty, was a minor topic. It wasn't something that anyone would actually spend time studying. Heschel gathers around himself small groups of students. He was a terrible classroom teacher. What would happen is, however, that if you met him in Shul Shabbos, he'd invite you to walk home with him back to his apartment on Riverside Drive. And each year, a couple of his students would become very close, and they became his acolytes. And today, they are some of the leading lights of the American rabbinate. Art Green, who is the dean of the Hebrew College in Boston, its rabbinical school, and many others who were deeply, deeply affected by Heschel's understandings of Torah. Here is a fish out of water, a religious, deeply, deeply religious man in a deeply secular and skeptical society of America, the 1950s. Here is a chassid, a man who's, and we'll talk about chassidism in a moment, but a man whose heart is in Torah, living in the sort of cold scientific environment of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And here is a man who understands that everything he loves and everybody he loves was just destroyed by the Nazis. And that has a profound effect on his conscience and his moral sensitivity. But there is a sensibility at the seminary, JTS, and a sensibility in the American religious community that somehow religion and politics should never touch each other, no matter how egregious those politics are. He's completely fish out of water. So he begins a scholarly career as a professor, and he writes 3 different kinds of things. He's going to write scholarly pieces, particularly about Hasidism. He's going to write popular Judaica, popular philosophies of Judaism. And his most important works, of course, are The Sabbath, the beautiful exposition, we'll take a look in a moment, of the Sabbath. His magnum opus is God in Search of Man. And the introductory volume to that is called Man is Not Alone, and plus many, many essays. And he writes about contemporary issues. And these are all gathered in his books of essays, and all of them are very, very worth reading. So let's take a look a little bit of Heschel. Let's take a look together and put this back up again. Hope that you can see this. I hope I can turn the page. There we go. In 1964, he publishes his book, God in Search of Man. And that very year, he gives a lecture in which he sets out his philosophical program. The lecture is called Depth Theology, and this essay is contained in a wonderful book of essays called The Insecurity of Freedom. Here's how he begins. Where is religion to be found? What sort of entity is it? What is its mode of being? I mean, what's the question? The question is, if somebody comes and says, I want to learn religion, where do we send them? How do we teach religion? One who is in search of art will find it as in works of art as preserved, for example, in art collections. One who's in search of literature will find it in books preserved in libraries. But what's the place of religion? So if you come and you say, I want to learn art, I know where to send you, to an art appreciation class or to a gallery or to a museum. If you want to learn literature, I send you to a library or to a literature course. If you want to learn music, if you want to learn science, if you want to learn anything, I know where to send you. But if you come and you ask me, how do I learn religion? How do I come to learn religion? And here's his question. Do visible symbols as preserved in temples, doctrines and dogmas as contained in books, contain the totality of religion? Well, here's what he's talking about. When I was in college, I took Religion 1, Religious Studies 1. What did we do? The first thing we did is read all the books. We read the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. We read the sections from the Upanishads and the Confessions of Confucius, sections from the Holy Quran, and sections from Thomas Merton's autobiography. Then we went and visited the sacred places. We went to the church and the ashram and the meditation center and the mosque and the monastery and the synagogue. We met the practitioners, we met the imam, and we met the guru, we met the priest and the minister, we met the rabbi. And then I took the final exam, right? What is the meaning of salvation in contemporary Protestant thought? What is the role of the state of Israel in contemporary Jewish theology? You know, what does sin mean in Catholicism? And I got a B. Damn it. The question is, do I know religion? I can quote its books. I can tell you all about its rites and rituals. I can tell you what the symbols look like. But do I know religion? Listen to Heschel. Religion, he says, has been reduced to institution, symbol, theology. Now the it here means that reduction of religion does not affect, I'll translate this in a minute, the pre-theological situation, the pre-symbolic depth of existence. To redirect the trend, we must lay bare what is involved in religious existence, recover the situations which precede and correspond to theological formations. We must recall the questions which religious doctrines are trying to answer, the antecedents of religious commitments, the presuppositions of faith. I'll translate that in just a second, but look at the next paragraph because this is going to help us understand what he just said. To some, the truth of religion is ritual. I don't know about you, but they're members of my family that like to play competitive Frumkeit, right? The question is, how many mitzvahs can you do? Who's more religiously pedantic than whom, right? So I used to make a joke that I had an uncle who used to question everything. And I once got him for Hanukkah a frumometer. You know, it's got a probe that you put in the mouth of a Jew, and it tells you just how frum he is, just how religiously pedantic he is. Because for some people, the whole idea is how many mitzvahs do you do? And if you can tell you that you do more mitzvahs, then obviously you're a better Jew. That's my uncle's attitude. To others, the essence of religion is dogma. That is what we believe. Listen carefully. There is another component, however, which may be regarded as the vital ingredient, and yet because of its imponderable nature, it often escapes the eye of the observer, that which goes on within the person, the innerness of religion. Vague and often indescribable, it's the heart of religious existence. Religion and myth, dogma indeed, remain external until there's a response from within the person, a moment of identification and penetration to make them internal. What is he trying to say? He's trying to say something truly profound here. What he's trying to say is when I was in Hebrew school as a kid, and I had to go to Hebrew school, we used to have these wonderful European teachers. And you know, I learned all of the sort of technicalities of Jewishness. You know, how do you put the candles in the menorah, and what order do you bless them, and what animals are kosher and what animals are not. And then the teacher would have a game. He said, you know, the one who says the Shema the fastest gets to go to recess. We reduce religion to the things we do, and to a catechism of the things you got to believe. But even once you've cataloged the things that you do and the things that you believe, you've missed the essence of it. The essence of it is something that happens inside. Because the ritual we do and the things that we believe and the symbols that we hold as sacred mean nothing if they don't resonate with something inside. So here's Heschel's challenge. This is what he calls depth theology. Take any species of religious life, any text, any ritual, any symbol, anything we do, anything we believe, anything that's sacred to us, and ask yourself the question, what happened to the person who created that forced them, that inspired them, that raised them up to create that? What happened 15 minutes before? What made them do that? Let me give you two silly examples, one deep and one rather pedantic. Let's take a text we all know. Let's take the text of the 23rd Psalm. The 23rd Psalm, the most famous psalm in the book of Psalms, right? So what's the 23rd Psalm? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures beside still waters. And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, you are with me. We all know the 23rd Psalm. If you've been to funerals, you've heard it over and over again. When I was in seminary, we had to learn it in Hebrew. We had to look up all of the ancient Near Eastern roots of all of the words, Ugaritic and Akkadian words. We looked for parallel texts in other literatures. We looked for ways it's used in liturgy. We undid that psalm. We deconstructed it in every way possible. And still, I can tell you, I didn't know the psalm. I didn't know the psalm until the day I had to go see an oncologist with my wife. And the oncologist put a screen up on his board, and he pointed to a white spot. And he said, this is your liver, and that white spot is the tumor. And we need to get it out, or it's going to kill you. And I said, can you get it out? And he looked at me for a long time, and he said, I think so. I think so. I said, what do you mean you think so? He said, well, it's close to this vein. It's close to this artery. It's a complicated surgery. You get a chill at that moment. You suddenly realize that life is not a guarantee. It's finite and it's fragile and you're vulnerable. And you suddenly understand what the psalmist meant when he wrote those words, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And then I feel my wife's hand in my hand squeezing hard. And she said, we will get through this. And now I understand the next line. I am not afraid, for you are with me. You are with me. That's what the psalmist meant. And I will never read the psalm again in the same way. It will never be a superficial text, because I can honestly tell you that, at least in my experience, I've walked through that valley and I felt that. And now I can reach out and hold someone else's hand and guide them through and show them the way to life. That's what the psalmist, that's what Heschel means when he says the innerness of religion. Every species of religious life, every symbol, every text, every ritual, all the stuff we do, all the stuff we believe in, is based on a repertoire of human experiences which all of us share. It's a formulation of those experiences. It's a distillation of those experiences. But if you read the psalm without returning to the experience that's underneath it, it's sort of like taking a spoonful of freeze-dried coffee and trying to digest it. It's awful. It's bitter. What you need to do is go back to the experience. That's how you regain a sense of the power of the ritual. Let me give you another example. And I hope there's nobody from Valley Beth Shalom listening. So we have we have a custom. We have a lot of bar and bat mitzvahs at VBS, my synagogue, which is beautiful because these kids are wonderful kids, and I get to spend a lot of time with them as they're preparing, get to know each other, and the kids are beautiful. But we have a custom that was bequeathed to us by Satan himself, in which we allow the parents to say a few words to their bar and bat mitzvah on the bima before the service gets started. And of course, parents, once you say a few words, that can stretch quite a ways. And I listened to speeches, and I would sit there for many years with my partner, Rabbi Shoais, alav shalom, and we'd listen to speeches. There was a speech we'd hear many times called Adventures in Obstetrics, where some woman would tell us about how it was that she birthed this child. I pushed and I pushed, and I don't want to keep that in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you. But then we'd hear the father say, son, synagogue is like a second home to us. And I'm sitting next to Shulweiss, who's rabbi of the synagogue for 50 years, and he turned to me and said, who are these people? I've never seen them in my life. They say, well, it's a second home. They may not get home very often. If you're watching this as a stranger, listening to these people make speeches to their bar mitzvah kid, it's kind of trite and kind of dull. But when it's your kid, or your niece or your nephew, or even better, your grandchild, then the words come out, and although they might sound trite and simplistic to someone who's an outsider, they capture your heart. How do you express the wonder and joy and glory of a child growing from infancy into teenage, and from teenage into adulthood? And here we stand at this gloriously special moment when we can see the baby he once was and the man he's going to be, the child she was and the woman she's about to be. And that's what Heschel says. Go back to the experience. That's depth theology. Now, let's take another moment of an excursus before we return to Heschel. In order to read Heschel, you've got to know three things: what kind of Jew he is, what kind of philosopher he is, and how to read him. Number one, what kind of Jew is Abraham Heschel? He's a Chassid. Now, forget everything you think you know about Hasidism. Hasidism, you need to know, was a revolution. It begins in the year 1700, because the 17th century, the 1600s, was one of the worst centuries in the history of the Jewish people. There were the Chmielnicki massacres that wiped out thousands of Jews in Eastern Europe. Then there was the great Shabtai Tzvi incident in the 1660s when this false Messiah arrives and captures the imagination of the Jewish world, and the Jewish world rises up to worship this guy. And then he ends up converting to Islam at the direction of the Sultan, and there is such a sense of disillusionment, of desperate sadness in the Eastern European Jewish community. And the rabbis of the Eastern European Jewish community, they tried to find a solution, but it turned out to be the exact opposite of what they should have been doing. They believed that the problem was too much religious enthusiasm. So they create the yeshiva culture. And what is the yeshiva culture? It's an ideology that says that only the wisest, most dedicated, most committed, most learned can come to God. All the rest of you schleppers, you support a scholar. That's how you come to God. But only the great scholars can pray, and only the great scholars can approach divinity, and only the great scholars can know what God wants in the world. Well, at the end of the 17th century, by the year 1700, there is a tremendous, desperate loneliness, sadness, and desolation in the spiritual life of Eastern European Jews. And so a revolution begins. And it begins in the person of a man named Israel ben Eliezer, who is a street musician, a street magician. Musician would be good too, but a magician called the Baal Shem Tov. He uses God's name to cure people and pronounces spells and makes amulets. But the Baal Shem Tov grasped the spiritual problem of Eastern European Jewry, and he offered a philosophy. It was articulated by his student, the Maggid of Mezerich. The Baal Shem Tov said, God has never left the world. God is available to all of us in all things, in all moments, in any way we want to approach God. The problem of theology is not metaphysics, that God is far away. The problem is psychological. We are so desperately sad, we have forgotten to feel the presence of God in all things. God is present in all moments, in all experiences, and in all things. Which means, of course, that if you're a scholar, so you know God through the books. But if you're the tailor, you know God through the work with needle and thread. And if you're a child, you know God in the simple ways that a child knows the world. And God is available in the yeshiva and the synagogue, but God is also available in the song of the birds of the forest and the animals of the forest. God is available in all things. And if God is available in all things, and sadness is what keeps us from experiencing the presence of God, then what we need to do is to dance, is to have joy. His great-grandson, Rabbi Nachman, is going to say, Tzarich liot b'simchat tamid. You have to be joyful all the time. Even when you're depressed, you have to force yourself to experience joy, because depression is ultimately a species of self-absorption. So what does the Baal Shem Tov teach? What does Hasidism teach? That religion is rooted in experience, in the experience of feeling God's presence. And the rituals and rites and symbols that we invent, these are simply distillations of those experiences, and too often they become obstacles to the experience. That's the problem. So here's the classic Hasidic story. A Chassid is arguing with a Litvak. Litvak is a non-Hasidic Jew. Rational, pedantic, skeptical. And the Litvak says, you know, the problem with you Hasidim is you don't obey halacha. You don't know the law. You don't observe the law. There's a time to daven in the morning, a time to pray in the morning, and a time to pray in the evening. And you Hasidim, you ignore these times. And the Hasidic says, you know, my brother, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Let me tell you what happens. I wake up in the morning, I take my talis and my tefillin and my siddur, and I go to the window. Get a little light in the room, I open the window. But you know what happens in the morning? The air of the morning fills my room, and it smells so delicious. The sun is rising. The children are going to school. I hear their cries and their laughter. I see adults on their way to their work. I feel the music of the morning. There is such energy in the room, and such life fills my soul that by the time I come back to myself, my God, it's too late to daven. So I determine in the evening, I'll daven on time. I take my siddur, I go to the window, I open the window, and my God, the music of the night, it enters my room. It enters my soul. It's dark, it's quiet. Families are gathered in their homes, around their fires, around their hearths. I can smell their cooking, and I smell the night, and I hear the quiet of the night creeping over the landscape. And by the time I come back to myself, it's just too late. So I have a solution. Tomorrow, I'll close the window. And the Litvak says, God forbid. Now, what's that story about? It's the experience that matters. The ritual is only a distillation and a container, a vessel for the truth of the experience. But when the vessel becomes an obstacle to the experience, that's when it has to be smashed and something new has to be created. That was ultimately the Hasidic revolution. And that's who Heschel is. He's pointing us in depth theology, and you'll see in a moment in God in Search of Man, back to the deep depth experiences of the religious soul. That's the kind of Jew he is. Here's the second thing, what kind of philosopher he is. He is a phenomenologist. Now, I want you to learn that word, and I want you to drop it in a conversation sometime in the next 5 days, because people will think you're very smart. A phenomenologist believes there are multiple ways to know. There are multiple ways to know because there are multiple phenomena that surround us. If you want to know something about how the natural world works, ask a scientist. If you want to know something about how the human heart, how the human soul works, ask a poet or a composer, or a musician, an artist. We have different ways of knowing, and you can't mix them up. If you want to know what does it mean, if you want to know how to cure COVID-19, Go find a good bioscientist, biochemist. Go find a good immunologist or an epidemiologist. He'll tell you how the disease is structured. He'll tell you why the disease spreads the way it does, and he'll tell you what we can do to stop it. But if you go to that same biochemist and you ask him, what is love? You know what he's going to tell you? Well, love is what happens under certain stimuli, that certain enzymes are released into the body, which stimulate certain proteins, which stimulate certain, and you're going to say, no, I don't want to know that. I want to know love. Well, the problem is you're going to the wrong guy. If you want to know love, you go to a poet, to an artist, and you'll know love. Heschel understands religion as a way of knowing the world. Science is a way of knowing the world. Mathematics is a way of knowing the world. Economics, political science, psychology, sociology are all ways of knowing the world. Religion is a way of knowing the world. It's a way of knowing aspects of our reality which can't be understood fully by sociology or psychology or economics or even biochemistry. If you want to understand holiness, if you want to understand why we are motivated to do some of the remarkable things that human beings do in reaching for what is right and good in the world, you've got to ask religion. Religion understands that. That's what Heschel means by the innerness of religion. So when you open Heschel, you'll find no proofs for the existence of God. See, a proof for something means I'm going to use one way of knowing to demonstrate the veracity of another way of knowing. I can't mathematically prove the veracity of love. And if you ask me, quite frankly, for a rational explanation of why I married Nina 40 years ago, I couldn't tell you. I was a crazy adolescent, crazy in love, and we've stayed in love ever since. It's not something you can demonstrate biochemically. You've got to ask an artist or a poet, and if you want to understand what motivates human beings at the depths of their being, this is what Heschel means when he says man's ultimate questions. When we really want to understand why we're alive and what we're alive for, well, that's what you go to religion for. And in that essay, he says the problem is that religion stopped doing that. Religion was not disproved by secular science. Religion was not displaced by rational skepticism. Religion went off its way. It's religion's fault. It's my fault as a rabbi. Stop talking the language I should have been talking. Because what we're supposed to be doing is answering people's ultimate questions. But when we try to do a lot of other stuff, then we fail. Then religion fails. And not just Judaism, by the way, but all of religion in Western society. Now, let's return to the text, and I'll show you how to read Heschel. Because now the question is going to be this: vague and indescribable. These moments of religious innerness can't be described in discursive language. But if they can't be described in discursive language, how the hell are you going to talk about them? He has a wonderful phrase, by the way, Heschel does. He talks frequently about the sense of the ineffable. If you look up the word ineffable in the dictionary, it means that which can't be expressed. Well, if it can't be expressed, how the heck are you going to talk about it? That's exactly the problem of religious philosophy. So what Heschel's going to do for us is build a new vocabulary. He's going to give us vocabulary tools in order to describe the steps that one would follow, the journey one might take in order to gain a sense of religious truth. And that's what the first section, the first third of his magnum opus, God in Search of Man, is all about. So let's take a look at a sample of that text. If you follow me here, he writes the following. The first word he's going to give us to help us understand how religion works is the word wonder. Listen carefully. Wonder, or radical amazement, is the chief characteristic of a religious person's attitude toward history and nature. Now, take that in for just a moment. If I were to ask people, if I were to ask you, what's the chief characteristic of a religious person? You might say, well, belief or faith. You might say observance or affiliation. You might have all sorts of interesting answers. I don't think wonder would be the first thing that comes to your mind. I went to 7 years of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The only thing I wondered about was I remember getting out of this place. Wonder? A sense of wonder? And how does he define wonder? Wonder is radical amazement, like Regular amazement's not enough. Radical amazement. So how do you define radical amazement? Oh, wow. When have you had an oh, wow experience in your life? An oh, wow. You know, my kid was born and the nurse handed me the new baby. Oh, wow. I watch a kid grow up and stand at a bar mitzvah, and I look into the eyes of her parents and her grandparents, and there's a grandfather who survived Auschwitz, and I say, oh, wow. And sometimes I go to the cemetery with the family and listen to their tears and their stories about the one that they love. Oh, wow. Religion, he says, begins in the ability to look at the world and instead of just simply analyzing things and understanding things and explaining things, responding with a sense of, oh, wow. Look at the next sentence. One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted, regarding events as a natural course of things. What's the opposite of religion? Well, you say the opposite of religion is atheism, doubt, skepticism. Nope. Heschel says those are important too, no question. But the opposite of religion is boredom. Because the opposite of religion is the person who walks the world and sees nothing that arrests his attention. Nothing's there, nothing happened. There's nothing to see here. That's the opposite of religion. The purpose of religion is the cultivation of wonder, of a sense of, oh, wow. Now just imagine that for a moment. The purpose of religion is to cultivate a sense of wonder. Just incidentally, by the way, who has that all the time? Right, children. You give a kid a Hanukkah gift that you shopped for months and paid a fortune for, and the kid unwraps the gift and plays with the toy for approximately 5 minutes. And when you turn around, what's the kid doing? He's playing with the box. Because what could be cooler than a box? Because a box can be anything. A box can be a fort. A box can be a truck. A box could be a house. A box could be a box. It's the greatest thing in the world. You want to see something great. I work in a large synagogue. We have a wonderful preschool. Whenever I get tired of dealing with grown-ups and their mishigas, I go downstairs to my friends who are 3. You know why? Because 3-year-olds take nothing for granted. The greatest thing in the world is you watch 3-year-olds, the poor teacher is trying to teach a lesson, and a bug crawls in the room. Oh, wow. Look at the bug. There's something wondrous about the way a child experiences the world. And the question is, why do we ever lose that? Look at the next paragraph. I have this line, by the way, on a card on my desk. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. Such a decline is an alarming symptom of our state of mind. Mankind will not perish for want of information, but only for want of appreciation. The beginning of our happiness lies in understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. What we lack is not a will to believe, but a will to wonder. As civilization advances, the sense of wonder declines. I think I'll interpret that, at least in very different words. The more education you have, the more boring you are. I don't mean that. I mean, I have a lot of education and I'm pretty boring, but the real essence of this is the more experiences you've already sort of racked up in your life, the more it takes to get you to stop and say, oh, wow, unless you cultivate a sense of wonder. I was a high school teacher in Manhattan for a couple of years. Yeah, Christmas vacation came along. I said to the kids, like, where are you going, you know? Where are you going? And the kid said, I got to go to Switzerland to go skiing. I hate it. You know, another kid says, I got to go to Paris. You know, I can't stand Paris. Like, what do you do if you're in 10th grade and you're already bored by Paris? Like, how the hell are you going to give that kid an experience that's going to wake him up? The cultivation of a sense of wonder, says Heschel, is the beginning of a journey toward appropriating life in a very different way. And now he builds a ladder of words. I'll come back to the screen in a moment. He builds a ladder of words, wonder, and then mystery, because everything he understands has mystery built within it. And then there's a sense of awe. Awe is to stand in front of an experience and realize that there's something so much bigger than you or I that's at the heart of this experience. And that's what he means by awe. And then finally, he comes to this place where he says all of this gives us a very different sensibility. And we come to understand that a question is asked of us. Let me just read this part for you. The sense of wonder, awe, and mystery does not give us a knowledge of God. It only leads us to a place where the question of God becomes an inescapable concern, to a situation in which we discover that we can neither place our anxiety in a safe deposit of opinion, nor delegate to others the urgent task of answering ultimate questions. Religion begins with a consciousness that something is asked of us. I want to come back to that line in a second. The ultimate question bursting forth in our souls is too startling, too heavily laden with unutterable wonder to be an academic question, to be equally suspended between yes and no. We can no longer ask, is there a God? In humility and contrition, we realize the presumption of such asking. The more we meditate, the more we clearly realize that the question we ask is a question we are being asked. That man's question of God is God's question of man. To really appropriate the world with a sense of wonder is to come to an understanding that I ask this question, and the question I want to ask is, what's the meaning of my existence? Do I matter? Do I have a place in the world? Where do I fit into this vast universe? Do I have any value? Now, to ask a question like, do I have any value? That's not an academic question. The chemist isn't going to answer it for you. The biochemist, the economist is not going to answer it for you. How do you answer a question? Do I matter? Do I have value? And here he offers this observation that my question, are you there, God, is God's question. Are you here? My question, do I have value, is a question of, well, what do you value? My question of where do I find purpose is the question, how much does purpose matter to you? And here, Heschel turns theology upside down. The name of his book is God in Search of Man, and he's playing with us because really what you'd expect the book to be called is Man in Search of God. We are looking for God. And Heschel says, no, that's not how it works. God's looking for you. Purpose is looking for you. Value is looking for you. You have to answer that question. You have to find it. And that's what he says, that we come to an understanding that something is being asked of us. Now, let me qualify this. When Heschel talks about God, he says something quite remarkable about God. Take a look with me, please. The next paragraph. He says, the Bible tells us nothing about God and himself. All the sayings refer to his relationship to human beings. His own life, his essence are not told or disclosed. We hear of no reflexive, no concern for himself, for God's self. No passion except a passion for justice. The only events in the life of life of God the Bible knows are acts done for the sake of man, for human beings. Okay, let me see if I can turn this page. Divine concern. The only thing we know about God, the only thing that we know about God, according to the Bible, is that God cares. All the metaphysics that we might generate about the meaning of God, about the nature and extent of God, really aren't relevant to the Bible, and they're not really provable in any case. Heschel says there's only one thing that you can say about God, that God cares. Now, he does a really interesting thing. He makes a sort of taxonomy of care. He says, a stone cares for nothing and nobody. An animal or a plant cares for itself and maybe its seeds. An animal cares for its own and for itself and its young. Human beings have that kind of care too. We care for ourselves and we care for our families, our circle. But we also have a different kind of care. We have something, not just reflexive care, care for the self. We have something called transitive care. I care for another. I care for another not because of anything they do for me. That's what we call chesed in Hebrew. I care for another because it's in my nature to care for the other, to reach out and care for the other. That's called transitive care. God, says Heschel, is entirely transitive care. And that's the only thing that you can say about God, that God is the essence of caring. So what that means is that when we care, we participate in the life of God. And if the question we're asking is, what is my value in the world? Why do I matter? Well, then the question is, what do you care about? How much care characterizes your being in the world? A very famous story of the Kotzker Rebbe, for whom Heschel wrote a biography. Young man comes to the Kotzker and he says, I don't believe in God anymore. And the Kotzker says, why? And the young man says, look at how much pain and suffering's in the world. And the Rebbe looks at him for a long time and says, why do you care? And the man says, what do you mean, why do I care? Look at, how can you have a world like this where people are hungry and people are in need and people suffer and people cry out and there's no one to answer the call? I have to care. Rebbe says, yeah, why? Why do you have to care? And the young man becomes more frustrated. He says, we have to care. How can you walk the world and not see this? How can there be such suffering and there's no echo in the universe for this suffering? I have to care. And the Rebbe asks him one more time, why do you care? And the young man loses it. He breaks down. He says, Rebbe, I have to care. There's nothing else in the world but to care. That's what I'm driven to do. And the Rebbe touches him and says, my son, if you care that much, then God is real. And I think Heschel would resonate with that story. Something happened to Heschel. He lost his family in the Shoah. He comes to New York. He's teaching at the seminary in New York from 1945. But in 1960, he begins to change his focus. He translates his doctoral thesis into English and publishes it under the title, The Prophets. I recommend this to you because it is, in my reading, the best book about the Hebrew prophets ever written. What he says about the prophets is remarkable. He says the prophet is the man who walks among us, except he has an exquisite sensitivity to the cry of the poor and the hungry and the bereft and the disempowered. That what we have in the prophet is a person who feels the pain of God at the poverty, the want, the need, the oppression that fills our world. That even the things that are trivial to us, and all of us, I live in Los Angeles, and we have thousands and thousands of people who live on our freeway off-ramps and underpasses. There's 60,000 homeless people, and all of us who live in LA, we've gotten used to them. We don't even see them anymore. Heschel says the prophet is that woman, that man who can't turn away, who feels the pain of God. Heschel never wrote a book about the Holocaust. He lost so much of his family in the Shoah. He never wrote a post-Holocaust theology. He never wrote an explanation of God after the Holocaust. But what he did do was dedicate that book to the 6 million. Which is to say that his response to the Shoah is to feel the pain of the world. That's how we respond to the Shoah. To participate in the life of God and to feel God around you and in you and through you. That's how Heschel understands theology. That's how I understand the being of theology, the living of a belief in God. And from that moment forward in 1960, Heschel becomes a social activist. His friend in the world, his closest friend, was the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. But one of his dear, dear friends was Martin Luther King, who Heschel made an alliance with and went down to Selma, Alabama on that fateful day to walk across the Pettus Bridge. And you'll see pictures of this. We're very proud of this because there weren't a whole lot of Jews who supported King. There were many, many more who wanted a more ameliorist attitude towards civil rights. But Heschel felt the pain of racism. Heschel felt the rage at the discrimination to African Americans. God only knows what he would be saying today about this travesty in Minneapolis or the catastrophe in Georgia. He felt it. It wasn't just a philosophical attitude. He felt the pain, and he went down there. And you have to understand that JTS professors, Jewish Theological Seminary professors, were never political. They were never political. And to the ridicule of the faculty, he goes down to Selma and he marches. Somebody wrote a critique and said, what is this rabbi marching with King? You can only imagine what the professor said to him. And of course, that's where he responded by saying, but I felt my feet praying. He becomes an activist for civil rights. He becomes an activist for Jews trapped in the Soviet Union. He becomes an activist becomes an activist against the Vietnam War. He becomes the chairman of the clergy union clergy and laity against the war. He becomes the chairman, and he's the most outspoken critic of the war because he felt the rage and pain of the Vietnamese people that were being destroyed by Americans' policies in that war. Heschel becomes this activist. A few months before his death in 1972, his Father Berrigan was being let out of Danbury prison. Remember, Father Berrigan was a chaplain, and he had destroyed records of the he destroyed records of the for the draft young men being drafted, and was sent to Danbury Federal Prison. And Heschel said, when Father Berrigan exits Danbury Federal Prison, I don't want him to have to look into the eyes of the FBI. I want him to look into the eyes that have spent a lifetime studying the biblical prophets. He becomes an activist. And it was very strange in that moment to be an activist because there weren't many rabbis who were. He was one of the great icons of this kind of activism that later became very, very adamant. And it comes from this theology of understanding that if you're going to understand God in the world, you have to feel God's care, and you have to feel God's rage, and you've got to act on it. And that's who Heschel was. Let's take one more look, because I promised you to teach you how to read Heschel, and I haven't done that yet, and I know that I'm delinquent in this. So let's take one more look at another species of his writing. Now, there are philosophers you can read. You can read quickly and you can read easily, because they're discursive and they write a lot. Heschel's a poet. He's a brilliant philosopher, but he's a poet. And the way that you read this is a tiny paragraph at a time. And I add a little Heschel to my davening, actually, because I think it's important to recognize that each line is very deliberate in the way that he uses words. Let's take one more look at one more observation he makes, and then I think it's getting really late, I know, and all of you want to get on with receiving the Torah tonight. So look at where it says sacred deeds, number 12. In our response to God's will, we perceive God's presence in our deeds. God's will is revealed in our doing. In carrying out a sacred deed, we unseal the wells of faith. A Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of faith. He is asked to surpass our needs, to do more than he understands, in order to understand more than he does. In carrying out the word of the Torah, he's ushered into the presence of spiritual meaning through the ecstasy of deeds. And I would translate that in a Hebrew phrase, simcha shel mitzvah, the ecstasy of deeds. He learns to be certain of the here-ness of God. Right living is the way to right thinking. Now, again, that's upside down. I mean, you want to say, I want to understand the thing, and then I'm going to do it. But Heschel says, no, it doesn't work that way. Frankly, it doesn't work that way with many of the things. I mean, how many of us understood what being married was like before we got married? But we jump into it because we have an intuition that there's a core of value to this, which is truly profound. And it's only after you've been married for a while that you come to understand how truly profound this is. For Heschel, the deed itself carries us into the understanding and not the other way around. He has a beautiful phrase that's later in that paragraph where he says, it's only through the selfless act that one comes to understand the true nature of the self. You don't know how good you are until you do something good. And my Bubba used to say, do a mitzvah, You don't know your own power to heal until you go and sit with someone who is ailing and hold their hand and tell them that they truly matter to you. You don't know your power to comfort until you go to the house of Shiva and hold the hand of the mourner and say, I'm here for you. You don't know your power to inspire until you've spent time with a little kid and taught him how to do something. For Heschel, deeds, and this is for Judaism, the essence of Judaism, Heschel will teach us, is the act, to jump into that act. And from that act, to let the act change us. I want to finish with one observation, and then I'll tell you what I would be glad to do, because now that I'm awake, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you're welcome to put it into the chat, and I'd be really glad to try and address your questions. But in 1964, I'll finish with this, and then those who need to leave and get on to other sessions, I realize my time is up. In 1964, Heschel was invited to the GA. The GA is the biggest Jewish convention in North America. It's the gathering, the General Assembly of the Jewish Welfare Federations of North America. They still have this conference every year. And he was invited to speak to this conference. And I'll tell you how you know, because I do this for a living. I'll tell you how you know when you give if you give a pretty good speech, they invite you back the next year. If you give a great speech, they never invite you back again, because that means you touched them. Heschel was only invited once. And this is what he said to them. He said to them, there are two words I want to erase from our vocabulary: statistics and survival. He says, you are too hung up about statistics, and survival is not the end and being of Jewish life. We have a spiritual crisis. We have to revive the sense of meaningfulness of Jewish life. We have to let people understand that this is a way of obtaining a sense of our value in the world and our power to change and shape the world and to live out the strictures of God's care. It doesn't matter how many of us there are. It doesn't matter that we survive. Survival is not the object. The question isn't to be, it's how to be and what to do with our being. That was in 1964. Imagine that today. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. I want to wish you all a very, very sweet and happy Yontif, a wonderful Simcha, a wonderful Shavuos, and a real Simchadik Shavuos, a really sweet time. I know it's a very, very hard time for many of us and many of our communities. Please, please take care of each other. If anybody would like to continue this conversation, I'm available at Valley Beth Shalom. Send me an email or text, and I'd be glad to share with you additional texts that you'd like to read or answer questions that you might have. I want to wish you all a very, very good evening. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. This